Hey everybody, I'm Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, we are going to talk about how Windows and Microsoft licensing isn't that hard. It's not that complicated. This is actually an urban myth. This is one of those things that somebody somewhere got kind of confused about licensing with Microsoft products somewhere 20 years ago and started telling people it was hard, and it just kept getting repeated and repeated, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People think it's going to be hard, so they assume that when something looks easy that they're missing something or that there's some trick to it, and they keep telling each other that it's really hard and you need specialists to help you, and it spirals out of control because everyone's feeding each other's frenzy, and people go into their licensing believing that Microsoft is somewhere between insane or just hates them and is going to make this as complicated as possible. None of that is real. If you go back and actually look at Microsoft licensing, more or less across the board, it is almost completely predictable by using common sense. That's how simple it actually is. You have to have a couple pieces of foundation, like they have to make money based on use cases so that people who use their products more pay more and people who use it less pay less. And once you apply a basic factor of how much they need to earn to pay for their products, you can figure out the rest pretty easily. None of it is actually surprising. Now, different products do have some different means of being licensed, so we're not going to delve into each piece and pick it apart and figure out exactly how they license them. But if you really spend some time and just look and empathize with what Microsoft would be trying to do in a way that would make sense and is still nice for their customers, it pretty much answers itself. It's just weird that people get weird about it. I don't know why this happens. But let's look at some of the most common products and talk about how they're licensed. If you're using Windows Server, for example, you require two things. One is a server license. This is the license that allows you to install the product. And then you need client access licenses. These are the things where you have to pay for a named user to use the service on that server. This is a pretty logical approach to software of this nature because it's combining the ability to have capacity with having users who make use of that capacity. If you really think about it, if they were to do it in any other way, it would really leave a lot of loopholes for people to manipulate how they use the system and get it essentially for free, which doesn't work. They need to balance how it's deployed and how much of their product is used and how much needs their support in exchange for money. And this allows for a pretty good way to do that. That makes it very difficult for some people to take advantage of them and others to have to pay a lot. It means everyone basically pays for what they use. It works pretty well. And the way that it works, like I said, you pay for a server license, and this can either be a standard license, which gives you 2 VMs per piece of hardware for each license, or a data center license, which gives you unlimited VMs on a single piece of hardware. And basically the crossover point is if you need 13 or more VMs, it makes more sense to have the data center license. That's about it. Just knowing that you need either standard for up to 12 VMs and data center for 13 or more kind of takes care of it all, and it allows you to play with your capacity needs as makes sense. That license is then dependent on the number of cores you have. In the past, it was dependent on the number of sockets that you used, the number of CPUs. As CPUs have changed over time from being dependent on CPU cycles to being dependent on cores for their performance and their power, Microsoft has had to change from socket licensing to core licensing. This is completely predictable. If you looked at the industry over any amount of time, it's obviously necessary that cores be an indicator of how much power you have in a system, especially given that Windows is only available for certain architectures. You can't just go around throwing Power or Spark or something like that at your system to try to get around core licensing or socket licensing. So it makes a lot of sense to do it that way. They could do it over something much more complex like BOGO MIPS, but that's too hard for customers to use. So cores are a decent proxy for indicating the amount of power in your system. And it's pretty straightforward. A core is a core. Sometimes people like to act like core is a mysterious term, but it's not. It's a very simple, very technical term, and there's no ambiguity to it at all. There's no case where you should be able to say, well, I don't know what a core is. That should never come up. Maybe we need a video that looks into cores and things and digs into exactly how to identify that. But if you look at your processors, they say how many cores they have. If you say things like, but I have hyperthreading, hyperthreading is not a core. No one claims it's a core. No one has ever suggested it's a core. It's not listed as a core on your processor specs. It's not a core. Microsoft doesn't consider it a core. The core means core, right? That's it. It's that simple. Same thing with client access licenses. They applied to named users. People say, well, what's a named user? If you can name a user, if you can put a name on a person and in some way they're getting some benefit from the server, they're a named user that needs a CAL. That's how simple it is. It's not, well, they could share a computer. Well, they're still named users. Who said anything about computers? Well, I may not know their names. Okay, but someone knows their name. That's all that matters, right? They're identifiable people. Whether you have identified them or not, they're nameable users. It's pretty straightforward. If you're in any way like looking for ambiguity there, you're trying to work around the licensing. And it won't work because their license documents are pretty ironclad. They've thought about all these people trying to get around those things. It doesn't work that way, but it's also not complex. Simply count up the number of users that you have. That's not the numbers of users at one time. That's not the number of users that could theoretically exist in the universe. It's the number of users you have in your organization that in any way could benefit from the server or the services on it. Those are your list of named users. Simply count them up, get that many licenses, maybe one or two extra for a little bit of buffer, that's fine. But that's what you need. Count up the number of VMs you need, look at the number of cores you need, and you can look at their guides as to how to compare that, but that's about it. It's not hard. None of these weird questions that people introduce actually apply. A lot of people want it to be complex, either because they're promoting another product or they want to sell services around licensing for Windows, and so they'll try to convince people that it's a lot more complex than it actually is because it might be to their benefit. But to you as an IT pro, yes, it may still be worth getting some guidance around these things because you don't want to go it alone. Nothing wrong with that. But don't come at the problem assuming that Windows licensing or Microsoft licensing in general is complex, because it's not. It's common sense, it's relatively straightforward, it is exactly how you would assume that they would tackle it if you spent time looking at licensing needs and trying to figure out what would make sense for their products. So if we come at it from that angle, we can do really simple things like determining how many VMs we need, how many devices they'll run on, how many cores we bought, and how many users we have accessing them. It's a bit of information, but it's not a crazy amount of information. It's exactly what you would need. Otherwise, you could have a ton of servers with only a couple of users and get it basically for free. Or you could have tons of users with only one server and get that for free. Or you do all kinds of different things to manipulate how your system is built in order to get around the licensing. And Microsoft has carefully made sure that no matter how you want to balance it or use it, that more or less you're going to pay for the capacity you use, and you're not going to pay a ridiculous amount for things you won't use. That's how simple it is. Now, they do offer a couple choices. We talked about CALs and named users. You can use device CALs instead, where it's the number of devices that can access the Windows servers at any one time. This gets a little bit more complex because people forget that devices may not have people associated with them, so then things like printers start needing to be listed, and we can think of it as named devices. Name everything that could possibly exist on your network, and all of those things have to have a client access license instead of the users. That can work. That gets a bit more complex, but there's no need for you to go down that path. It may be the better thing for your business, so certainly consider it, but the average business doesn't want to do that, and if you're looking for simplicity, you don't need to do that, right? And if you're anywhere close, generally you want to go with named users, because named users are so straightforward and so simple. You hire a new person, you pay for them. That's it. The other products in the Microsoft portfolios are similarly easy. If you're looking at one side of the extreme, you might look at HyperV. There's no licensing at all. It's simply free. And strangely, HyperV is one of those products that people tend to point to for how complex Microsoft licensing is. I'm not sure how this happens, given that HyperV is 100% free in 100% of scenarios. There is no such thing as a HyperV license. There's no option to pay for it. There's no place that you can pay for it. There's no suggestion anywhere in anything from Microsoft ever that you would need to pay for something related to HyperV. And yet, people think that its licensing is somehow confusing and complex. Free kittens, take one. There's nothing more to know, right? Other products like RDS, the remote desktop services, you have to pay for each user on top of anything else. It's a software product additional to other things you've purchased. It's that simple. If you were buying it from a third party, you'd expect to have some kind of cost, and paying a CAL per user that's going to use that service is a completely reasonable way to go. SQL Server is similar, and they do offer some options, and once in a while having multiple options for licensing while giving you more power does become a little bit more confusing, because you do have to sit down and look at the different options. Are you going to do core licensing, where you only pay by the core that you are going to run SQL SQL Server on, or do you want to have client access licenses and pay by the named user? Sure, choices add complexity, but neither type of SQL Server licensing is complex on its own. It's simply that you need to look at both and determine which makes sense for your organization and your workloads. That's all. So what I'm trying to get across here, one, is that it's not that complex, and two, Microsoft isn't out to get you, nor are they crazy. Give them the benefit of the doubt, approach their licensing as if they're sane, rational actors, and if you are a sane and rational actor with them, they can be a great team player here, and you don't have to end up in a situation where you're confused about your licensing, or you're double paying, or whatever. Ask questions online, people are out there to help you, but be aware if something sounds suddenly crazy and someone's telling you you have to buy an insane amount of stuff, they're probably wrong. And if you hear suddenly that things got really, really expensive, they're also probably wrong. For example, a lot of people are freaking out now that we've moved from socket to core licensing. However, they leave out important things like the price was slashed so that the average number of cores that you would now use is the same price as the average CPU count you would pay for in the past. So the price didn't really change. It's just the number of cores you have to license, of course, is higher than the number of sockets because we have lots of cores per socket. All things that should be common sense and very straightforward and cause no one to panic. Yet people freak out thinking that because they have 16 cores that they're going to pay a lot more than they had to pay with 2 sockets. But they don't, because they're figuring 8 cores per socket and they're roughly the same price between them. Not hard, and we didn't change that we have to count things, we just changed from counting sockets to counting cores. That's no more complex, no more strange, no fewer factors than we had previously, just ones that are more applicable today. So once again, common sense reigns supreme. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like, subscribe. I'll have the link below. Please consider supporting us on Patreon. This takes a lot of work to make these videos and to get them out for you. There's a lot of content that we like to make, and even a very small sponsorship on Patreon can make a very big difference to making this be a continued platform for IT education. Thanks for joining me. Talkadillo is a cloud-hosted or fully managed on-premises IP PBX platform providing businesses with simple and simply affordable voice communications. Visit Talkadillo.com and learn more about how Talkadillo can change how you view your telephones and help to support SAM IT.